Well, thank you all so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be with us this evening. And before we begin, I'd like to just give a quick shout out to Reese Huntington and the team at Shark Club. Y'all do a fantastic job, tremendous amount of work to put these things on, so let's just give it up for them. As many of you may know, my name is Grant, and I've been hunting for shark's teeth for about 20 years now, and that's what we're going to talk about today, so I hope you all are ready for that. In order to really understand, this is where these transitions are going to get me. In order to really understand the nature of shark's teeth, where we find shark's teeth in the Lowcountry, and what's going on in terms of the geologic framework of our region, it's, in my opinion, important to take a brief glance at what the Lowcountry has to offer in terms of its geology. And so I'll start this off by saying that much of the geomorphology of our region is very complex. It's very much influenced by river processes. We do not have a great amount of consolidated sediments at our disposal, and so much of the sediments that we're using to understand the nature of South Carolina's past along the coastal plain is going to consist of sands, muds, clays, fine sediments, unconsolidated sediments. And so these sediments are highly susceptible to erosion via river processes as they carve through the landscape. And so this graphic is a depiction of, generally speaking, some of the more prevalent formations that we find throughout our region. We start off with the 10-mile hill formation, and so this is going to be a Pleistocene age deposit that consists of lag. So lag is river winnowed material, and that is to say material that is eroded by rivers and deposited by rivers. You're going to find a great concentration of bone in this layer. So this is going to be whalebone, dugong, which is a species similar to a manatee. The dugongs are still extant off the coast of Southeast Asia, but nonetheless we do find a great concentration of bone in this layer, as well as many different species of shark's teeth. And so many of the shark's teeth that we find in this layer are going to be heavily reworked as they've been tumbled and tossed out of the original formation by river action and so forth. Going beneath that, we get into the Chandler Bridge Formation, which is one of my personal favorites. And this is an Oligocene age formation, so roughly 25 to 35 million years old. And this is going to be predominantly clay, or a sandy clay. And so because of how fine this sediment is, it typically does a very good job at preserving shark's teeth and the other fossil material that you find within it. And so you can find shark's teeth in this layer that are just as sharp as the day that a shark lost them, which is very exciting for us. So once you go below the Chandler Bridge, we come into contact with the Ashley River Formation. This is a limestone base that does not have a great concentration of fossil material. And so we find that the concentration of the fossil material in this layer is just going to be incredibly sparse. And so for our intents and purposes, we like to stay on top of the Ashley River Formation. And so, like we mentioned before, the influence of river processes is very important for us, as many of these layers are going to be discontinuous and sit at an unconformity. And what that essentially means is, if you're not already familiar with it, is you could be standing right here and you could be digging in a very rich, very abundant layer of 10-mile hill, for example, and you could be finding scores of megalodon teeth. But if you take 10 steps over here, you're going to be completely out of it. And likewise, in the opposite direction, you can take 10 steps over here and be completely out of it. And that is true for all of the predominant formations that we find throughout the Lowcountry. Because of the way that rivers have shaped the landscape, we do not find these across distance to be very consistent. Now, the other really interesting thing about the geology of our region is the mineralogy and the abundance of different minerals that we find present in the strata. And so a couple of different examples of this are going to be phosphate. Phosphate is of high abundance in the Lowcountry. During the turn of the century, between the 18 and 1900s, there was a commercial mining operation for phosphate, and this was actually used in plant fertilizers. There's still an ongoing industry for phosphate in Central Florida, but that industry in the Lowcountry of South Carolina has since vanished. Now, another common one that we find is going to be manganese, and there are several others, but without going into too much detail, the mineralogy has a very profound impact on the colorations that we see in the fossils that we find. And as we know, a fossil is basically just a composite of the minerals that are found present in the strata that are surrounding it once it's deposited and becomes fossilized. And all of those minerals replace the original material in the bone or tooth. Now, we can see this firsthand. This is just a small sample of some of the shark's teeth that I've found throughout the years, digging and diving throughout our region. And as you can see, you just about get every color of the rainbow. One of my personal favorites here is going to be this lightning streak pattern. And so this pattern is caused by mineral leaching through plant roots. After a prolonged period of time being exposed to plant roots, you get this coloration pattern, of course, which is very exciting. But as these teeth dry, especially when you find teeth that are directly coming out of the formation, their colors will tend to pop as they dehydrate and they're exposed to the atmosphere. And so this gives another layer of excitement to finding these teeth. It's like finding them all over again. Now, there are many species of shark's teeth that we find throughout our region. And this is just a small sample of some of the ones that we'd like to investigate a little bit here, at least on a surface level. So we'll start with the Galioceratocontortus. So this is an Oligocene-aged tiger shark, much smaller than their modern counterparts, the Galioceratocuviae, which we all know and love. The Hemipriestis serra is a snaggletooth shark, and these teeth are actually very desirable amongst collectors because they're hooked, and on the inside of the hook, the serrations are very pronounced. On the outside of the hook, the serrations are very fine. And so people love those teeth. I do as well. The Desserai and Retroflexus are a couple of different species of makos. We have short fin, long fin. But the Carcharoides subserratus is a serrated reef shark variant, and the Totserratus is the non-serrated variant. There are 3 different species of threshers that we find, or actually there are more than 3 species of threshers that we find, but these are among the most notable. The Alopius grandis being the giant thresher. This is by far the most common of the 3 mentioned here. The Palatasi is a serrated thresher. These are exceedingly rare, very exciting to find intact. The Trigonatotus alteri is a cusped thresher. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. The Paratotus benedini, pictured here, is a very unique tooth in that science does not fully understand the nature of its evolutionary lineage. So they are believed to have shared a lineage at some point with threshers and makos, and that is evidenced by their tooth morphology. Which brings us to the Ototus angustians, which is one of my absolute personal favorites. We'll take a closer look at this species in a second. On a surface level, this is going to be the grandfather of the Megalodon, and so this existed during the Oligocene. And really, the main takeaway from this piece is going to be that sharks' teeth exhibit variations in their morphological structure, coinciding with the adaptation of those sharks to occupy their own specific ecological niche, and more specifically the feeding habits associated with that niche. And these can actually become quite extreme. So if I could find a marker, maybe there's not a marker. The Adestus is not mentioned here. This is not a species that we find in the Lowcountry, but the Adestus is commonly referred to as the coal shark because those specimens are really only found deep within the coal mines in places like Indiana. And absolute certified freak. I mean, this shark is an absolute weirdo amongst sharks. But I would implore you on your own time to look into this more. But those characteristics that we mentioned can also be very, very subtle. And so once we begin to study how these morphological characteristics have changed over time, we can begin to understand the evolutionary history of sharks on a much more intimate level. So, the Ototus angustidens is pictured here in the center. Now, this is not the entire evolutionary lineage of Megalodon, but these are some of the more prominent members of that lineage, which is the Ototus lineage. And so, if this image were blown up, one of the first things you would notice is the development of serrations. And so obviously serrations are a very effective tool for slicing through meat. But you'll also notice these little side cusps here. And so these cusps are believed to be a vestigial trait of sorts left over from when these earlier sharks were feeding on smaller food items, like small fish, and small fish can be very tricky to catch and grab hold of. We also see this characteristic on modern species like the sand tigers that you see at the aquarium and scuba diving just off of our coast here. But that is the belief behind the presence of that trait, which obviously became a vestigial trait as Megalodons ate large porpoises and whales. So another thing that you'll notice about this lineage is their root structures. So these earlier sharks had much thicker root structures than their later counterparts. And the belief behind why this occurred is if you're a shark and you have these thick root structures, your teeth are going to be very firmly planted in your jaw. And so if your teeth are very firmly planted in your jaw, you are not cycling through teeth very rapidly, and you are reusing the same teeth over and over again. And so this becomes disadvantageous to sharks in the long run because you're essentially hunting with dull knots. Now, starting off on the far left over there, this is going to be the Ototus obliquus. And if you've ever been to a gift shop or seen shark's tooth necklaces for sale, you'll oftentimes see these. There is a commercial mining operation in the Kharibga region of Morocco that produces these teeth in great abundance, and they are sold in wholesale over here for jewelers and so forth. This is the Ototus auriculatus coming up next, and as you can see, still very pronounced cusps, still very thick root, but we eventually transition to the Ototus angustidens, and the problem that we find with these species in particular is that because of their thick root structures, feeding damage is extremely common amongst these teeth. You'll oftentimes find them with their tips completely destroyed, cusps broken off, and with the angustidens in particular, we oftentimes find these with root pitting where acidity in the sediment has leached through and compromised the structural integrity of the root. Now this is the Ototus tubustensis. So it can be difficult to determine at times the difference between late angustidens early Chubastensis or late Chubastensis, early Megalodons. And this becomes a case-by-case basis where you're essentially looking at what other fossils are being found present in those geographic areas that is going to give you more insight into the identification of the fossil. And some of these are going to be index fossils, which were organisms that existed across a broad geographic distribution, but only existed during a short period of time. But those factors are very important to consider when we are trying to identify some shark's teeth of some relative ambiguity. And then, of course, everyone's favorite, we arrive at the Megalodon. And so the Megalodon is, sort of without mentioning, the heavyweight champion of sharks. The geographic distribution of these is going to be global. You'll find Megalodon teeth on every single continent except for Antarctica, which I don't blame them. Antarctica's too cold and ain't nobody got time for that, you know. But the largest recorded Megalodon tooth is actually sort of up to debate at this point, because there's a very prominent specimen that comes out of South Carolina that measures a little over 7.15, 7.25 inches, somewhere in that range. And there's another tooth that circulates online and in the media that rivals that tooth. And so it's kind of unclear at this point which one takes the cake as far as the world record is concerned. But nonetheless, that is a massive, massive shark. And there's sort of some controversy surrounding not only those teeth, but how those teeth became world records, how they gained notoriety. Because whenever we're dealing with large world record-breaking specimens of teeth, there's always a potential for restoration or repair to be involved. And so if you're ever curious about how to determine if a fossil is 100% natural and authentic, you can do two things. One, you can expose the bone or tooth to a black light, and this will make the epoxy and the material that artists have used to render the specimen back into what it was believed to have originally been before it was damaged or broken by nature or feeding. And the second option is to simply pour acetone onto the bone or tooth, assuming that you are not already too emotionally attached to it, because if it is repaired, this will absolutely destroy it. Now, we know how large these sharks are simply by looking at their teeth. And this is true for all sharks across the board, regardless of species. But the primary assumption is that you're taking a sample from the anterior of the jaw. And as you've seen on modern sharks, their teeth become smaller as you move towards their posterior positions. But 1 inch on a shark's tooth roughly translates to approximately 10 feet on the actual shark. And the way that you measure this is directly from the corner of this root lobe down this axis, the longest side, I promise it's not cheating, to the very tip of the blade. And so the most precise measurement that you can take is with digital calipers. And so from an industry standpoint, we always like to use our caliper measurements when we're reporting the sizes of these teeth. So there are a number of theories in circulation with regard to how the Megalodon went extinct. The most prevailing theory, as far as I'm concerned, at this point in time, is that these sharks simply hunted whales to the point where they could no longer sustain their own populations. These were absolutely an apex predator, and they drove whales down to dwindling numbers. But really, in the grand scheme of things, shark's teeth, broadly speaking, are not that scientifically important. because of all of the prior research that's been conducted and because of their relative abundance in the fossil record. Now, this is especially true when their teeth are not found in situ, which simply means deposited in the original strata where the shark lost them millions of years ago. And because of all the river action that's taken place in the Lowcountry, it's very difficult to find teeth that come straight out of situ. Now, there are obviously some exceptions to this rule, and this is one of them. So this is the Carcharodon habeli. This is named after an esteemed shark research scientist out of the University of Gainesville in Florida. Him and his team helped describe this species here. And this is, as you can see, basically a complete skull. Incredibly rare to find a complete skull of a shark, given that their skeletal structure is composed entirely of cartilage. But under the right conditions, this can happen. But this means that you need very fine sediments that are gentle on the fossils when they're deposited, and very anoxic conditions, meaning low oxygen. But nonetheless, this is an absolutely spectacular specimen, and it displays partially serrated, partially non-serrated edges on its teeth. And so the non-serrated edges are indicative of what was previously thought to be the Asurus histalis, later reclassified as the Cosmopolitotus histalis, and later reclassified as the Carcharodon histalis. And this is the evolutionary precursor to modern-day great whites. Prior to this discovery, it was believed that megalodons were the evolutionary precursor to modern-day great whites, and this completely debunked that hypothesis. Of course, these serrated edges are indicative of great whites as we know today, but the region where this specimen comes from is the Ocucaje Desert region of Peru. And so in this region, you can find fully articulated whales, dolphins, porpoises, and several species of sharks that are constantly being eroded out of the desert sand and slowly withered away due to exposure to the elements and time. And the governments of these countries have actually since taken action and completely banned the export of not only fossils, but artifacts due to some very devastating archaeological work that was done in that region during the 1980s that depleted these countries of their historically and culturally significant resources. So this, in my opinion, is a very important benchmark in the history of paleontology to consider when we are examining the evolutionary history of sharks.
Grant, that's just a different angle of that other picture on the right?
Yeah, this is just a close-up of the jaw, and it's got several rows of teeth going back. I don't know how they prepped this out, but they did a fine job with that. It's actually still in the collection of the University of Florida at Gainesville. I believe it's in Gordon Hubbell's private collection, but yeah, absolutely incredible piece. So this is just to give you a general idea about some of the places around the world where you can find shark's teeth. Obviously, we are here in South Carolina, but you may be looking at this and think to yourself, Grant, you were too turnt when you made this presentation because there ain't no way we're finding shark teeth in Kansas. But we do. And this is because of the Middle American Seaway that ran through the interior of North America, through modern-day United States, all the way into modern-day Canada. And you can find mosasaurs, several species of sharks throughout this region, but it's very interesting, and not a lot of people know that. Is there anyone in here from the West Coast, California, anywhere? Okay. Okay. Close enough. So if you are ever out west, Bakersfield, California is a little known place where you cannot, there's an Ernst quarry, it's called the Ernst quarry, and they find an extinct species of mako called the Planus mako. It's a hook-tooth mako out there that you really don't find anywhere else in the world. But much like our region, the teeth that you find out of Bakersfield, the colors are absolutely mesmerizing. Their mineralogy is very rich, very, very exciting. The Baja Peninsula is another place you can find them. At one point, while they were digging the Panama Canal, they actually came across a deposit of megalodon teeth, and so when that happened, they were trying to understand, scientists were trying to understand the shark nursery that they believed to have found by digging the Panama Canal. And we talked about South America a little bit, but very, very rich area, and some of the most world-class specimens of megalodon teeth that have ever been found have been found in South America. One of the hottest things on the market right now still, and was one of the hottest things on the market at the time when I originally put this presentation together, is Indonesian megalodon teeth. Now the problem with Indonesian megalodon teeth that are on the market is the Indonesian export industry is notorious for repairing and restoring teeth way beyond what should be reasonable, and there's some problems associated with that in the community because it's kind of a false advertising scheme. So if you're ever buying shark's teeth online or looking at fossils online, it's always important to make sure that you're buying from a reputable seller. But at one point, there was actually a story about a megalodon tooth that was embedded in a rock formation in Australia at a state park. And so it was stolen by someone. Now, don't even go stealing shark teeth from a state park, all right? But it was kind of an interesting little read that's out there on the internet. And at one point, there was a commercial dredging operation off the coast of Malta and New Caledonia and Fiji that produced scores of megalodon teeth, but that operation has since ceased. Japan, and really all over the place. And so these sharks preferred tropical to subtropical waters, and that has not really changed a whole lot. Now that's just to give you an idea about just places that you can find shark's teeth globally. But obviously we are here in South Carolina, and it is a place where I am fortunate to collect. But while scuba diving is my preferred method to find shark's teeth and other fossils, this can be very exciting, but also presents a series of challenges. And so one of the most common questions that I get is, do you see alligators? And we do, but I will say that the American alligator does have a brain. Sometimes I'm not so sure if our recreational boaters do or not, but we do see alligators nonetheless. And what this really comes down to is if you come up too close to the bank. Because if you come up too close to the bank, mama could be there with her nest, and mama is very protective of her nest. And she has every right to be. But if you come up too close to the bank, and the gator is there with the nest, the gator may start to pursue you as a threat to the nest. Now, it is very important that you be aware of your surroundings, and hopefully you will acknowledge soon enough, not only that you are too close to the bank, but also the gator coming at you, that you make an effort to get yourself away from the bank. And once you do this, 99 times out of 100, the gator will stop chasing you. We deal with very low visibility conditions in our rivers. And so this is a pretty accurate depiction of what you would see on a regular day diving any of our rivers. visibility is extremely limited, and we use powerful dive lights to see. Now, certain rivers at certain times can have zero visibility, and so you may just be feeling on the bottom for shapes. And sometimes you could be up to your elbow in mud, just feeling, and you could grab hold of something and it just slithers away, because there are organisms that live beneath the substrate, and so this makes for a very exhilarating experience, as you could probably imagine. Boat traffic, like we talked about, is a huge, huge problem. This is a commercial barge similar to ones that I've had go over my head. And the draft on these varies depending on whether or not they're loaded down with material or not. But whenever one of these goes over your head, it sounds like tennis shoes in a drying machine. Like,
Wow.
10 out of 10 would not recommend, like, at all. Not a pleasurable experience to be had. And of course, there's weather conditions. Weather can change on a dime, swift currents, and equipment failures. So how many divers are in this room right now? I know a few. No? You gotta get on. I'm just kidding. But yeah, what's like the first thing that they teach you in scuba class? Don't panic. Hide that. But yeah, no extra credit for you. Very, very important, because although you may deal with these things on a regular basis, if you have air, you have time. And time is very, very precious. And if you have time, you can typically think and resolve your way through a series of challenges. And so, especially when we're dealing with anything having to do with technical diving or any of these hazards, very, very important to keep that in mind, because your life literally depends on it. And so, with that being said, thank you.